Hello, I'm Melissa Chan, guest hosting Al Jazeera's The Stream Home Edition. Today we'll be taking a closer look at Japanese Hafu. Hafu is a term signifying someone who is half Japanese and half something else. Now, Japan is a homogenous country, a very homogenous country, so Hafus stick out, for better or worse. As usual, post your comments and questions on YouTube. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible so you too can join the stream. Tetsuru, Megumi, and Mitzi, welcome to the program. If you can each introduce yourselves, let's start with Mitzi.
Hi, I'm Mitzi Uehara-Carter, and I'm a professor of anthropology and East Asian studies at Florida International University in Miami, Florida. I've been writing about Black and Okinawan issues for quite some time now. Thank you.
And Megumi?
Hi, everybody. I'm Megumi Nishikura. I'm a documentary filmmaker. I focus on telling stories about the multiracial Japanese experience. And in 2013, my partner, Lara Perez Takagi, and I made the film Hafu about the mixed race experience in Japan.
And Tetsuro, tell us about yourself.
Hi, I'm Tetsuro Miyazaki. I'm half Belgian, half Japanese photographer. And I've been working on a photo project called Hafu to Hafu. I don't have a cool poster like Megumi does, but I happen to have the book here. It's a photo project about being mixed Japanese, and for this one, I've photographed and interviewed about 150 half Japanese people from 100 or more different other countries.
Excellent. So first things first, hafu, which is a Japanese word derived from the English word for half. Is it a derogatory word? Can we even use it, or is it commonly used in Japan? Whoever wants to start and answer this question.
Sure, I can go ahead. Yeah. Obviously, we called the film Hafu, and myself, the filmmakers, everybody who's involved in the team, doesn't feel that the term is derogatory. We intentionally called the film Hafu, H-A-F-U, as opposed to half, the English word half, because we believe that it is a Japanese term now. And it really directly means somebody who has one Japanese parent and one non-Japanese parent. And I think, it's a commonly used term. It's the most common used term within Japan. And it's very, when you meet somebody for the first time and you explain that you're a hafu, people instantly understand that you have one Japanese parent and one non-Japanese parent. So I think it's a large part of the community accepts it, embraces that term.
And of course, one of the most well-known hafus these days is Naomi Osaka, and there's been so much commentary in Japan about how Japanese she is and whether she's Japanese enough. And so that makes me very curious in terms of your personal experiences being hafu in Japan. Were there particular moments that you remember? And how are you treated? Perhaps, Mitzi, you can start.
Well, I grew up in the United States, so I will have a very different experience from someone who grew up in Japan, and especially someone who, maybe speaks only Japanese and maybe no other, other language. So I have a very particular experience. When I go back home to Okinawa, which is also a very particular place in, my relationship to this term, even hafu, or to other mixed race people is very different, I think, for other people who are in mainland Japan. I think for people who are mixed, for people who are half Okinawan and half Black in particular, we have it's a very complicated story. I think for people of my generation and maybe a little bit older, we are not totally seen as part of being, part of really being integrated in the nation and into that space. And there are a lot of painful stories that many of us have shared with each other. Sometimes they're very beautiful stories. It really depends on, I think, the moment, the political moment, the political climate, and Yeah, it's there's so many factors that go into how you are feeling in that particular moment.
Right.
I don't know if maybe Megumi and Tetsuro have a similar situation or feeling about that, but that's definitely how I've
Yeah,
Yeah.
felt about that.
Well, from a very
how
personal perspective, there are moments where you love everything about being half Japanese. I mean, you get all the perks of being half Japanese. You go to Japan, you get the tasty Japanese food. You speak Japanese, or that's my case. Speak Japanese. I have relatives in Japan. I have friends in Japan, and I have a second home in Japan. But on the other hand, there are plenty of times where I wish I were not mixed. I were just Belgian or even just Japanese. So it really depends on, as Mitzi said, it depends on so many factors. It depends on the political climate, but it depends on the people you're with. It depends on and the mood you're in, and your own age. So where am I in my life?
I want to
Yeah,
actually share one. Oh, we'll go right to you, Megumi. I want to share a
sure.
comment that we've had received on Twitter about this issue from Dr. Afak AQ. He says Japan is a country of Japanese people. Their traditions, customs, festivals, worshiping methods, birth and death culture is way different from the rest of the world. Even if the political system wants to minimize this ethos, they will never change. I have lived there. Japan won't change. And so, Megumi, I'm curious what you think about that. Did you ever experience that? Has your experience been more positive or negative or a mixture of both?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Japan, and for me, growing up speaking Japanese as my first language, and then having a fully Japanese name, I grew up identifying as Japanese first. And I think, a lot of the encounters, especially when I became an adult and had to go outside of my, immediate bubble of family and friends that you kind of interact with when you're a child and your world is very small, and suddenly when you become adult and you have a much larger world and you have to interact with new and strange people all the time, I received a lot of kind of disbelief that I could be Japanese. People would say, "Oh, your name is Nishikura. Are you married to a Japanese man?" Because that's the only way I could have a Japanese last name. They would always compliment me on my level of Japanese, and so that's a lot of experience that I had, and it got to be very exhausting and constantly having to explain and justify your existence. And that's part of the motivation of why I made this film. But specific to the comment that we just received, I mean, absolutely, Japan has I think an unspoken definition of what it means to be Japanese. And there's these boxes that you have to tick off that, like, you look Japanese, you speak Japanese, you have to have Japanese citizenship, and you have to be culturally Japanese. And if you can't check off all of those boxes, you're not Japanese. And, I think what's one of the brilliant things about Naomi Osaka is that she actually doesn't tick a lot of those boxes, but she is Japanese and she's representing Japan on the world stage. And, I think that's really challenging a lot of people about broadening their definition about what it means to be Japanese. So I think change is happening. Absolutely.
I definitely want to follow up a little bit. And if you could tell us a bit more about your film.
Sure. The film follows 5 different individuals who have all different mixes. And behind you can see David at the top. He's half Ghanaian and Japanese. And below is Sophia, who's half Australian and Japanese. We also have somebody who is half Venezuelan and Japanese, half Korean and Japanese. And you just saw some clips earlier of a little boy who's half Mexican and Japanese. We see a variety of experiences, but central to each of their storylines is kind of how being half Japanese impacts their daily life. So we see people who completely live outside of Japan, and, you know, come to Japan for the very first time to experience their roots. And we see people who have been, you know, born and raised in Japan and primarily only speak Japanese, but on a daily basis struggle with, you know, finding their place in Japanese society.
Tetsuro, about your global project, I definitely encourage everyone to check it out after this program, but tell us about some of the lessons or takeaways you got while going around taking photographs of hafus around the world.
Right, well, where should I start? I think I should start with my own very narrow world. I grew up in Belgium, went to Japan most of my summers, and I interviewed about 15 half Japanese people in the Netherlands when I was living there. And I thought after 15 people that I had a pretty good idea of what being half Japanese was, until I got invited to this Hapa Japan festival in Los Angeles, where I met hafu from the rest of the world. And those included some of the people Megumi has talked about already, some others as well. And that's when I realized that I had this huge blind spot on my radar. I did not know that there were non-white Japanese hafus. I mean, I could have imagined, but I didn't know them. They were not on my my radar, as I say. So meeting them for the first time and hearing their stories really opened up this huge new box. And that's when I decided to try and capture the full range, if you want, of being half Japanese. So even though by, for example, media or beauty standards, you're not half Japanese if you're not this talented, young, white Japanese multilingual person, I wanted to find people from different generations, people from every single continent, from as many countries as possible. So I made that my goal. And what I found out,
Oh, finish your thought, and then I'll ask the question.
What I found out that I thought was the most interesting find of my project is that basically you can divide the whole hafu community in two. So you have the hafus who are born and raised in Japan, then you have the hafus who are born and raised outside of Japan. And each of those categories can be then divided in three, being visually identifiable Japanese, but white.
Right. Yeah.
And you have the second, visually identifiable Japanese, but non-white. So that encompasses Africa, Latin America, parts of Asia.
Right.
And then you have the third group who are non-visible, let's say the invisible hafu, and they are Chinese, Japanese, Korean Japanese. And we all have completely different experience. There's something that unites us, that's this label of being hafu, but what sets us apart are these factors. Those are the biggest factors that I've seen.
Well, that's what's really interesting to me as I started hearing the voices and reading interviews of different hafus, is that not all hafus are treated equally. I want to bring up a comment from Jun Sojima, who is a well-known television personality in Japan who is hafu. And this is what he had to say about his own experience.
I really hated being different from other people when I was in elementary school. I kept wondering why I was a different colour from other people and hoped that I could become the same as everyone else. But now being different in Japan, having different coloured skin, has turned to my advantage. And there's this moment when you realise this.
And then I also actually want to share another video comment back to back from Ranzo. He's founder of the Black Experience Japan, just to give people an idea of some of the negative experiences of being different looking in Japan.
In a phrase, the Black experience in Japan is myriad. right? It's not monolithic. If you think about it, there are a multiplicity of factors that goes into influencing each person's experience. To be honest, you'll find experiences on different registers across the spectrum, some really, really good, some really, really bad. It really depends on a lot of factors. When it comes down to inclusiveness and Japan, rental discrimination is still a thing in Japan. It's a fact. I faced it recently when I was trying to find a larger place to live in. There's still a lot of work to be done, of course, but I remain optimistic because I've interviewed people within Japan who occupy certain positions and roles within the Japanese society that back in the day, maybe 4 decades ago, would not have been possible. So I think there's some progress, but a lot of work still needs to be done.
I mentioned at the beginning of the show that Japan is a homogenous country. Just to throw some numbers out there for people to keep in mind, of the 125 million people, approximately 2% are migrants. And of course, a lot of these migrants could easily blend in. A lot of people from China and South Korea, for example. In terms of refugees, 10,000 people applied to be refugees in 2019, and only 40 people got their applications accepted. And other interesting numbers. I know that, of course, this is a population that is aging, and also not many people are having as many children. So it's a shrinking population. And so the government is concerned about trying to bring in more people. But the fact of the matter is, a Pew poll from a few years ago shows that only 25% of people in Japan are really ready to accept immigrants. I think we've sort of danced around this, but there are words for this: xenophobia, racism, and certain views of blood purity. And I wonder what you guys think about that. Is that what's driving some of the negative experiences that Hafus have had in Japan? Maybe I'll start with Megumi.
That's a great question. I mean, I think Japan has a long history of it's an island nation, and it has a history of its borders being closed. And so I think that and then there's also this, self-perpetuated image of itself and, perceived by the rest of the world that it is homogenous. And so that kind of, narrative continues to exist. And so people are, Japanese people believe that, they're largely one people, one culture, one nation, one language. And there's also a lot of, I think, societal pressure to go with the flow, be accepted. There's a saying that everybody likes to say that the nail that sticks out gets hammered down. And so, I think if you're even a little bit different, and like the boxes that I alluded to before, if you don't check all of them, that you tend to be, treated differently within Japanese society. Right. And that's not just for Hafus. I think that's, 100% full Japanese people also experience this, where, you have slightly different views, or you're kind of don't want to go along with kind of the expected behaviors of Japanese society. And
so anyone who sticks out, essentially.
Yeah, sticks out. And so that's why there are rates, high rates of suicide, and as well as like hikikomori, like people who kind of, are recluse and don't want to participate in society. So it's that kind of huge sense of, needing to conform to society. That pressure is so intense. And if you don't fit into it, you kind of get pushed out or locked out of it.
Mitzi, what do you think? I mean, you studied a lot of this.
Yeah, I think we have to be really careful when we talk about Japan as a homogenous nation, as Megumi was referring to, this kind of Nihonjin-ron myth. And as the Twitter comment came in, I was thinking about the same thing. This idea that Japan is unchanging. It's this kind of it reifies this idea that it's an essentialist place, and it reifies that kind of idea that it's unchanging, and it can never be a place of acceptance of difference, when that's really not the case. And it ends up further isolating and marginalizing the experiences of so many different types of mixed race people within the nation state. So we have to be really careful about perpetuating that myth of homogeneity. It's a dangerous one. It's one that we put onto Japan. Historically, we've done that. Anthropologists have done that in my field. But also, I think Japanese people have taken the single story myth and really, it's very dangerous for mixed race people. And so it is dynamic. Japan, like many nation states, are dynamic. They deal with xenophobia. And there's a pushback to that as well. I mean, maybe the pushback may not be as fast as we would like, but it is changing. And there's Black Lives Matter protests within Japan that are organized by Japanese people who are trying to really make a change within their own countries. I mean, when we had a Miss America competition, I think it was in 2013 or 2014, when an Indian American woman, Nina Duval, I forget her name, but her last name. Remember when she was crowned Miss America, or she was crowned some pageant head, and there was so much pushback because people were questioning, like, can she really be American? I mean, they're fourth generation Asians who've been living in this country, and they're still like, where are you really from? We still get that kind of question,
It's interesting because we've also seen that barrier being broken in beauty pageants in Japan with Ariana Miyamoto, and also, of course, Priyanka Yoshikawa, 2016 Miss World Japan. And that has really moved things along in terms of the conversation. Now, you just mentioned, of course, Naomi Osaka talking about, you talked about Black Lives Matter in Japan, and earlier Megumi was talking about Naomi Osaka. I want to share what she posted at the US Open. She was showing up and wearing a face mask with the names of people who have been victims in the United States as a result of people thinking that Black lives do not matter. And that's sending a very strong statement. And also, she is Japanese, and I wonder to what extent her presence has changed things. I'm curious about looking ahead in terms of whether the next generation of Japanese will be more open to hafus and to immigrants and to citizenship in general. Tetsuro, what do you think?
Well, I think role models are really, really very important. So people who become Miss Japan or really successful sports players can make a big change in, firstly, I think, in the self-acceptance of younger people. So many half Japanese people growing up on the countryside don't know anybody who looks like them or who, let's say, does not look like the others as they do, if that makes sense. So having role models is so important, and that goes for Europe as well, where I live, and I'm sure that works the same way for the United States. You need people to look up to who can achieve things despite what they look like, and maybe take it to their advantage.
Absolutely. I want to hear Megumi and Mitzi's thoughts on this. We're getting near to the end of the show, but Megumi, if you can tell us what you think in terms of what attitudes needs to change and your thoughts about the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as Tetsuro said, like, the importance of role models is really, so valuable. And I think right now, we've seen role models in kind of popular media, whether they're TV talento, as they like to call them, like celebrities in Japan, or now athletes. And so I think, it's partially just a kind of a numbers game. Like, it's just a matter of time. I mean, as sad as it is to think that, like, the population of Japan is declining, like, the number of mixed babies are, growing. And so
that's going to change.
That's going to change. And I think, what I'd like to see as these generations grow up and participate in Japanese society is not just the people on TV and on the sports fields, but in business leadership and, like, nonprofit leadership, like different areas of society we're going to start. And there are a few politicians already.
And I I want to get, I'm so sorry, but I want to make sure that Mitzi also has a quick thought since we're really getting near to the end. Mitzi, if you can give us your one quick sentence and thought about the future.
One quick sentence. No, I actually agree with Megumi here that, representation is definitely important. Of course, I would love to see more people for, as Tetsuro said, for younger people who are maybe isolated in the countryside. Those seeing yourself in the popular media is very important. At the same time, we've got to, educational shifts have got to be made. We've got to address anti-Blackness that have been transnationally absorbed into the country.
Got it.
Yeah, those are the bigger, harder questions that
Thank you
I can't
so
do in one
much.
sentence.
Thank you so much, Tetsuro, Megumi, Mitzi. Thank you for joining Al Jazeera's The Stream.